Our panelists for panel 2 are Michael Bryson, Senior Vice President of Operations, PJM Interconnection. Susan Tierney, Senior Advisor, Analysis Group. Anthony Campbell, President and CEO, East Kentucky Power Cooperative, and speaking on behalf of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. We also have Emily Fisher, Executive Vice President, Clean Energy and General Counsel, EEI. Rick O'Connell, Executive Director, GridLab. Bobby Olsen, Associate General Manager of Salt River Project, speaking today on behalf of the large Public Power Council. And Michelle Bloodworth, President and CEO of America's Power. If it's okay with you, Chairman, we'll let the panelists begin. Okay, Mr. Bryson, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Chairman Phillips, Commissioners. Thanks for inviting us. I will try to be brief since Chairman Phillips and Commissioner Danley made most of my points already. We are also at PJM experiencing this transition. As generation resources retire, we are, certainly concerned with reliability into the future. The rate of electricity demand is increasing in PJM. The pace of retirements, I think, is one of those things that, frankly, Commissioner Danley was concerned about the orderly retirements, that concept, and the pace of retirements and the orderly retirements is something that concerns me very much. We released a paper back in February about retirements, and we made a number of assumptions about retirements and came to a number of 40,000 megawatts between now and 2030. And we've already been wrong about that in a number, either faster retirements or retirements that we didn't even see on the table. We look at, certainly the impact of the IRA, which I appreciate has a lot of stimulus in there, but we also look at the Ørsted announcement about Ocean Wind 1 and Ocean Wind 2, 7,500 megawatts, which is supposed to be replacement megawatts. And so this balance between what's retiring and what is being replaced is something that concerns me very much from a reliability perspective. I learned a term this morning from Andre Porter at MISO, which I think is good, which is we need to match the pace of retirements with what contributions we're getting on the grid from a reliability perspective. I do agree we've been working closely with the EPA. We will continue to do that. We think it's important to get workable rules in here for reliability. I also will continue to provide resources from PJM's perspective. I know Commissioner Danley suggested that we have even more reliability analysis in part of this rule, and we intend to do that. I think one of the things is really thinking about some of the comments that were made is we do not have the same grid we had 5 or 10 years ago at the beginning of the match rule. Back at the beginning of the match rule, I was not that concerned about retiring units. We had a significant amount of margin. It's now a different system, and every retirement causes significance. So appreciate the opportunity here. Looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bryson.
His little button.
That little tiny gray button. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. I'm probably the oldest person on the panel, and I'm going to take that and run with it. A common theme that occurs when EPA issues proposals to control power plant emissions is that industry stakeholders raise concerns that the proposal, if adopted by EPA, would jeopardize system reliability and thus conflict with the industry's obligation to provide around-the-clock electricity service. Red flags were raised in 2010, 2011, again in 2013 to 2015 when EPA was considering emissions regulations of various pollutants. In each instance, I wrote reports highlighting the critical importance of the electric reliability and described the tools available to the industry to ensure that reliability was maintained. Some of these tools were designed into EPA's proposals then, and other tools are standard elements of the ever-evolving reliability Swiss Army knife, CHAMP, that has all of those tools that you can pull out and that you find new ones all the time. I am not meaning to make light of that metaphor. In each instance in the past dozen years, the industry and other stakeholders predictably stepped up to ensure that actual reliability was not compromised. Many stakeholders have commented that in light of the significant changes underway in the electric system, and I have crossed out talking about them because you've been talking about them all day, the stakeholders have commented that EPA's recent proposal errs for, among other reasons, by not allowing enough time for compliance. Although some of the particulars this time are different than in the past, there are reasons to be assured that this new EPA rule will not jeopardize electric system reliability. And I just finished a report that's available on my company's website on this topic. First, electric reliability institutions, tools, processes in place today actually are better than they were in those other instances. The system evolves, the institutions evolve, the tools evolve. And you know that NERC is on top of identifying reliability risks, recommending approaches to mitigate them, and working with all of the stakeholders, not to mention their overseer, in addressing those issues. Second, significant attention is already being paid by you, state regulators, reliability organizations, others, to address confounding circumstances, gas and electric coordination, cybersecurity, transitions in the generation portfolio, transmission expansion, all of the things that you've talked about today, including equity concerns. All of that needs to be addressed whether or not this particular rule or some variant of it goes into effect a decade from now. The grid has to remain fit for purpose for the changes ahead. And third, the EPA proposal has all of the elements that Administrator Goffman went through when he was here just a few minutes ago, and I won't repeat those. Unquestionably, regardless of the requirements that new gas plants and existing fossil units will have to do to comply with new greenhouse gas emission rules, the industry must take and is taking steps necessary in each month and year necessary to ensure reliability is maintained. Your turn. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in the discussion of reliability impacts of EPA's proposed greenhouse gas rules. East Kentucky Power Cooperative is a not-for-profit generation and transmission electric utility in Winchester, Kentucky. We are owned and governed by 16 owner-member distribution cooperatives that serve more than 1 million Kentuckians. EKPC's mission is to safely generate and transmit reliable power at competitive rates. National Rural Electric Cooperative Association is a national trade association representing 900 not-for-profit local electric cooperatives and other rural electric utilities. EKPC and NRECA's overall position is that EPA's proposal is unlawful and unworkable. The only way that the proposed rule will not have detrimental effects on the electric liability is for EPA to withdraw it. I'd like to briefly outline the elements of the proposed rule that will be disastrous for grid reliability and also suggest steps the Commission can take to mitigate the damage. EPA's proposal is not salvageable. The real question is whether reliability might be salvageable. First, even if we put aside the enormous cost involved in the proposed rule relies on CCS and clean hydrogen, neither of which are ready at levels and scales for a sound economy that requires certainty and not in all regions of the country. The infrastructure needed for both technologies is not now and will not be in place at the scale to meet EPA's deadlines. For instance, the developer of the Heartline Greenway CCS pipeline project relied upon by the EPA in its analysis recently canceled the project. Lost my place. Clean hydrogen is even further behind than CCS. Under the proposed rules, state plans are due in the summer of 2026. It is virtually impossible for operators to make permanent decisions to meet that timeline. They will be forced into either retirement of essential dispatchable coal units or curtailment of those units to capacity factors below 20% by 2032 and complete retirement by 2035, and curtailing the use of natural gas units to capacity factors below 20% starting in 2032. The disorderly retirement and elimination of baseload generation will leave the electricity grid with a significant deficit of dispatchable generation that cannot be replaced by intermittent resources, especially during a time of economic growth. EP has proposed several additional regulations that also threaten reliability. EPA's ozone transport rule, the steam effluent limitation guideline rule, and the CCR rule. The cumulative impact of all these will be devastating to grid reliability. Once the proposed rules go into effect, it will be too late, and the consequences to reliability will end up at FERC's doorstep. The Commission should direct the NRECA to undertake assessments of the proposed rules' impact on reliability. EPA should include them in its regulatory impact analysis. EPA should also take its 2023 MOU with the Department of Energy on reliability seriously and engage the full Commission and others in re-examining the rules' impact on reliability. Finally, FERC should submit comments urging restraint as part of the OMB-ORIA upcoming review of the proposed rule. EKPC and NRECA appreciate the Commission's time and attention to this crisis in the making, and reliability is too important to get this wrong. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Emily Fisher. I'm glad you mentioned the 2 to 3 minutes because I was going to produce some receipts from my inbox that I was promised longer. But in the interest of time, I'm going to say thank you, skip the rest of the niceties, and cut to the chase. As was discussed this morning, the clean energy transition is already underway and has already resulted in significant greenhouse gas emissions reductions from the power sector, as EPA had recognized in the proposed rule. And at this time, more than 40% of our nation's electricity comes from clean, carbon-free sources. At the end of 2022, the last year for which we have complete data, the sector's emissions were as low as they were in 1984, and has also been noted we accomplished the goals of the Clean Power Plan, even though it was never implemented. Before EPA proposed the Section 111 rules that are at issue today, more than 50 EEI member companies had voluntarily committed to reduce their emissions, with more than 2/3 pledging to reduce their emissions to zero or net zero. EEI filed extensive comments both in the non-regulatory docket before this rule was proposed and in response to this proposal. We'll file those in this docket, and we're happy to answer questions at any time about the hopefully constructive suggestions we made about how to ensure that this rule can support an affordable, reliable, clean energy transition. As was evident this morning, regardless of any final EPA regulations addressing greenhouse gas emissions from new or existing fossil generating fleet, the clean energy transition is not going to be easy. Challenges do not mean, however, that this transition is impossible or that our larger goals about a resilient, equitable, affordable, clean energy future should change. What these challenges do mean, however, is that we all need to work across a myriad of stakeholders to solve them, be prepared for progress to be bumpy on occasion, and be willing to be as flexible as possible to preserve reliability. The investor-owned electric companies are committed to working with the Commission, EPA, state regulators, NRECA, customers, environmental groups, and anybody else who'd like to come to the table to make this transition successful. As a preliminary matter, like many of the panelists here today, electric companies do have concerns about the adequate demonstration of CCS and hydrogen blending, which EPA has identified as the technical basis for the standards. Our member companies believe that these technologies are necessary for a resilient clean energy future because they will address resource adequacy and some dispatchability concerns. For this reason, many of our members are working on demonstration projects, often with IIJA funding, to help us prove out their performance and provide insights into their cost curves. What really gives us pause then is not the technologies themselves, but EPA's estimates about when they will perform at levels that will allow member companies to plan for compliance, and assumptions that EPA has made about how quickly the necessary supporting infrastructure will be built out. Even if we gain more confidence in the performance of these technologies, it is not clear to us that the infrastructure that we will need to actually plan for compliance will be available in the timeframes that EPA has proposed, and that could lead units that will rely on these technologies to have to make some tough decisions, including closure to avoid penalties. However, to achieve our clean energy goals and emissions reductions goals, many electric companies do plan to continue to retire a number of remaining coal-based generation that they currently operate. EPA included voluntary closure subcategories in the proposed rule, which are things that we proposed in the non-regulatory docket last year. And we think that these have a real opportunity to reduce emissions and ensure that necessary capacity is available during the next decade. Rules that accelerate the closure of these units would compromise reliability, especially during critical peak periods. These subcategories aren't perfect. We've provided a lot of feedback on how they might work. We're happy to talk about them, but their inclusion in the final rule is necessary. As a final comment, I will say that one of the things that these retirement subcategories can do is help us bring order to the transition, and that if you are going to opt into these categories, these will have to be done in time for states to include them in plans. And that means after 2 years, we will have a very good sense of which rules are about to close. I have additional comments I'd be happy to address on existing natural gas standards, but I will leave it at this for now. Thank you.
That's a tough act to follow, Emily. Hi, I'm Rick O'Connell. Thanks for having me here. I'm the executive director of GridLab. My organization is a public interest organization with a focus on providing technical assistance to regulators with a real focus on reliability. The grid can absolutely be reliable under the proposed EPA rules, but we'll need to plan and take action to ensure grid reliability is maintained. I think the rules codify, like we just heard from Emily, what's already happening due to economic and policy forces. The retirement of aging coal plants and the introduction of new resources, primarily wind, solar, and battery storage. Over 2 terawatts of these resources are under development and in interconnection queues around the country in both organized and vertical markets. To maintain grid reliability, we need to ensure these resources enter service in the coming decade so they can provide energy capacity and grid services that will replace retiring coal and allow for larger gas plants to transition from energy resources to capacity resources. If we properly plan, we can bring on the right portfolio of new resources. I believe these rules will actually bolster reliability, and I think Emily commented on this a little, by providing regulatory certainty needed to effectively plan in a coordinated manner with actionable deadlines. We heard earlier from Jennifer Miso that in the current environment, grid operators are unsure about what resources may retire, increasing uncertainty and making planning harder. The proposed rules have long timelines for enactment, giving states, utilities, and grid operators plenty of time to plan for the transition. So how can we be sure that a future grid without coal and with significant variable generation will be reliable? My organization has performed several detailed studies looking into how the U.S. can decarbonize the power system to 90% carbon-free, and the answer is straightforward. We deploy significant quantities of wind, solar, and battery storage, and couple this with existing carbon-free resources such as nuclear and hydro, and we use the existing gas fleet to provide balancing and capacity. In our work, gas provides just 10% of annual energy to the system, but remains a significant capacity and reliability resource. Similar studies have been done by NREL, Princeton, and many other planning entities. In fact, MISO's own futures used for transmission planning are very similar, retiring most of the coal and with gas running with single-digit capacity factors by 2040. We also heard earlier this morning about essential reliability services and attributes. I think that my sort of traditional definition of essential reliability services, things like inertia, or frequency response, regulation, operating reserves, voltage requirement. We believe strongly these services are critical, but the amount of these services is far less than the firm capacity of grids. So in addition, I think also grid-forming inverter-based resources can provide these services and can perform even better than traditional thermal resources. So the grid transition isn't going to affect the provision of ERS, and I think that's not going to impact. So I'll leave it at that. I think the Commission's already done several things that's going to enhance reliability. I think Order 2023, Order 896, Order 901 were all really important. And I think there's things that the Commission continue to do to ensure grid reliability as the transition continues. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Bobby Olsen, and I am the Chief Planning Executive for the Salt River Project. I'm appearing today on behalf of the Large Public Power Council, which represents larger asset-owning members of the public power community, and on behalf of SRP, which serves more than 1 million electric customers in central Arizona and with approximately 9,500 megawatts of resources. SRP has embarked on an ambitious effort to reduce carbon in one of the fastest growing counties in the nation. To meet the projected load increase that we see of more than 35% by 2035, while also closing more than 2,600 megawatts of coal-fired generation, SRP plans to add more than 7,000 megawatts in new renewables, 2,500 megawatts of new storage, and 2,000 megawatts of new gas generation. By 2035, SRP will have increased its carbon-free energy delivered to our customers from about 30% today to nearly 75% by 2035. Two features of EPA's proposal pose significant concern for SRP because CCS and hydrogen are not likely to be available in the time frame EPA's rule contemplates. First, constraining the use of SRP's natural gas-fired generation to a 20% capacity factor for new and 50% for existing resources would severely hamper SRP's ability to serve load if we continue to see 3 to 4% annual load growth driven by high load factor services such as manufacturing and data centers. Second, SRP is committed to retire its coal-fired Coronado generating station by the end of 2032. Until then, Coronado will be critical to serving our load when triple-digit temperatures drive demand for more than a third of the year in Phoenix, well over the 20% that would be allowed underneath the proposed rule. SRP's studies also show that we may fall critically short of having the capacity needed to serve our load if we substantially restrict the ability to operate firm resources on our system. For these reasons, I strongly recommend that FERC call for NRECA to study the reliability implications of EPA's proposal and hope that EPA consider NRECA's analysis in its final rule. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, for the opportunity to offer these opening comments, and I look forward to the discussion.
Hello, I'm Michelle Bloodworth. I'm President and CEO of America's Power, and I certainly want to thank the Commission for inviting me here today, but also for discussing this important project. I do want to make two things clear at the outset. First, we are opposed to the carbon rule because of its unrealistic compliance deadlines, the lack of adequately demonstrated infrastructure, as you've also heard from others, and the potential for undermining grid reliability. Second, the reliability impacts of EPA regulations should be properly analyzed and mitigated before this rule is finalized and implemented. There have been numerous warnings about a grid reliability crisis. Certainly yesterday, NRECA, in their winter reliability assessment, showed large portions of the United States at risk of escalated blackouts going into this winter. Coal certainly provides many of the attributes during extreme weather and provided 47% of the increased demand in PJM. One of the primary reasons is the premature retirement of dispatchable resources, mostly coal. So far, more than 40% of the nation's coal fleet has been retired. Past EPA regulations certainly contributed to many of these retirements. However, despite clear warnings, an alarming number of coal-fired power plants continue to retire. And our concern is that people don't really understand the pace and how fast that number has escalated. Joe Goffman, I'll bring you the answer to his question. One of the Commissioner Christie asked him, currently the coal fleet today resides at about 188,000 megawatts. In 2011, it was 317,000 megawatts. According to EPA's own projections on the impact of the carbon rule, the coal fleet basically would stand in 2030 at 58 gigawatts. That's a reduction of 69% of the current capacity of the coal fleet today. In 2035, the coal fleet would virtually be eliminated. They are estimating only 12 gigawatts of coal would be left, which is a 94% reduction. The carbon rule certainly would undermine reliability by forcing the premature retirement of coal plants, but also the loss of essential reliability services, many of those that have been provided during periods of extreme weather, polar vortex, Uri, and many others. The carbon rule would basically put the entire coal fleet, 100,000 megawatts of units with many fuel secure and other essential reliability attributes at risk of prematurely retiring. We agree with Commissioner Danley that there has not been a proper analysis looking at the disorderly retirement of coal plants. NRECA defines reliability as resource adequacy and operating reliability. In EPA's own analysis and information, they have not done any credible analysis to look at the operating reliability. Can we get the power during periods of sudden extreme events or sudden disturbances? Can we get that power to load? That analysis is what concerns us the most, because many of these units, including gas and coal, provide those essential reliability services that MISO, PJM, and others have identified. as Tony Campbell mentioned from East Kentucky Power, the difference between when the MATS rule was implemented, yes, the markets have changed. We have 6 EPA rules. And so we don't think that EPA has properly analyzed if I'm an owner of a coal plant and if I'm complying with the good neighbor rule and I have to spend $100,000, I may decide to make that investment so that coal plant stays open in 2026. However, if I'm looking at having to spend $1.5 billion to comply, if I want to keep my coal plant beyond date certain, I have to have that equipment installed by 2030. That's why we think these numbers and the time frame have been totally underestimated. We believe because the carbon rule is so flawed, we think there are severe limits to what can be done to avoid reliability problems. We do not think the existing tools are adequate. RMR agreements are meant to address temporary transmission security issues. They are not meant to address resource adequacy. Likewise, Section 202C orders by the Department of Energy, they are to temporarily suspend compliance retirements, and they're not an effective way of supporting reliability because these orders are intended to be last minute. If we have thousands and thousands of megawatts of coal plants that are going to retire in a very short time frame, we certainly think FERC needs to take the time to ensure that we understand and develop those tools before this rule is promulgated.
Ms. Bloodworth, for the
Thank
sake
you.
of time. Yep, thanks. Chairman, over to you and the commission for questions.
Thank you. And thank you all, panelists, witnesses, for their testimony. It's very illuminating. I'll start with you, Mr. Campbell. You do not mince words, sir. No. You use words like, you use words like unlawful, unworkable, and unsalvageable. I take those charges very serious. And so we're here today to learn more. You were pretty crystal clear, though, in your reason why you think that. I want to give you an opportunity to say anything else that you couldn't say in 2 minutes about why it should be withdrawn. And then I'd like to hear from the other panelists any response they might have.
So first off, the technology is being developed, but it's not here. And the EPA's pointed to a few projects, but they're not scaled up and they're not online. So the time frame is way too short. I mean, if you think about it, it took us 100 years to get to where we are, the most reliable, dependable, affordable electric system in the world, and now we're trying to change it in 8 years. And that's just not going to work. We need more time to get to these new technologies that are being developed. Even if we went to nuclear, I mean, which we're looking at nuclear, small nuclear reactors are probably 20 or 25 years out, so we don't think it's workable. The other thing that we think it's not workable is, and we have one G&T up in North Dakota that is working on carbon capture and sequestration, but they've got a field underneath them about 10,000 feet to put the carbon. We've looked at our plants and we don't have to. That means we got to pipe it for a long way somewhere. And we can't even get natural gas lines ran, much less CO2 lines ran. So we just think it's unworkable now. They need to back up and say, hey, where we want to go, and then give a timeline that's reasonable.
Ms. Campbell, for elaborating. We'll go to Mr. Olsen.
Thank you very much. When it comes to the concerns with the rules, one of the things that I would put forward is timeline is one of the most important aspects to it when it comes to the infrastructure and technology available to it. When you look at where SRP is located out in Arizona, I would refer you to the SunZia transmission line. It's a transmission line between New Mexico and Arizona. It's taken more than 16 years to get permitted. And I think I would use that as an example of where you have adequate investment, you have interest and desire by energy entities, but really just out in the West, we have a significant amount of federal land, and that adds to the permitting requirements, the siting requirements to actually get infrastructure built. And so while we understand and appreciate the mission that EPA is trying to accomplish to it, we think it needs to be met with the practicality of trying to turn plans, no matter how ambitious, into reality and infrastructure.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. When I think about the question, I think about and we keep going back to it, it's a question of timing and magnitude. And I just look at a microcosm of, we just had Brandon Shores and Wagner over the last 6 months announce retirement in the Baltimore area. And there have been a lot of good proposals about other alternatives for that area, but all of them. Okay. Sorry.
Would you please refrain from talking?
Yes, I will, yeah. When I think about, when I think about retirements of huge magnitude retirements anywhere in the system, look at some of the ones that are coming up in Illinois, and some of those replacement technologies, a timing and magnitude becomes the issue. And I think that's one of the problems, I think, with this rule, is we got to recognize that.
Ms. Fisher.
Thank you. I'm not going to comment on the lawfulness of the rule. I think that will be decided by others at a place maybe not so far from here, sometime next year in 2025. But I think in the near term, it behooves all of us to see if we can make this rule as workable as possible, so that the final rule, if we do have to implement it, is something that could actually serve dual purposes, which is support the clean energy transition and be reliable. And I think there are some suggestions that were made over the course of today that are worth considering, and I certainly know that those are conversations that we're having with EPA right now. But one of them that I wanted to highlight was something that I believe Acting Administrator Goffman mentioned. I'm sure I just promoted him, so I'm sure he's excited about that. Or maybe not, but we did have a process under the mercury and air toxic standards to identify units that were not going to be able to comply on the timeframes provided, and to look at whether or not those units had a reliability implication, and then to give them extra time. And it actually was a group effort. It was the unit owners and operators, it was the balancing authorities, it was FERC, and it was EPA. And I think it's possible for us to design similar structures here, and we should do that. So that units that, some units can close without reliability impacts, some cannot, and we need to identify those as quickly as possible and figure out how much additional time, or what sorts of limitations on their operations need to be put in place. I agree with Michelle, 202C is not the right tool for this. It is an emergency tool, and we should be planning further ahead. I will also note that we provided a lot of comments to EPA about additional flexibilities in and around compliance that will help make some of this rule more workable. Some of this stuff is not exciting. I need better averaging provisions. I need EPA to tell the states that they're okay with us converting to mass for compliance, because we think it provides more operational flexibility, particularly for the natural gas fleet. And as you heard from many of the people here today, there are some pretty interesting limitations on their ability to run, and mass-based compliance is more flexible than a rate-based when you have operational limitations like that. I'll leave it at that, but I think we all need to work together to make the rules workable as possible if we have to implement it.
Dr. Tierney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually want to bank off of Emily's comments just now. She really identifies a number of ways in which EPA has identified that it wants to make this a workable and lawful rule. And I suspect that EPA is really looking at the law pretty carefully after the Clean Power Plan and other actions. But I do want to mention that we do have experience in circumstances where there was implementation of these reliability tools. I'm thinking of one instance in Connecticut where there was a reliability must-run contract put in place during the pendency of a transmission upgrade for reliability. I'm thinking of the Alexandria coal-fired power plant that wanted to retire. Its owner wanted to retire it. It couldn't retire. The Department of Energy invoked its authorities. A transmission line was built in PJM in order to accomplish those location-specific reliability issues. There are many tools in place to address these granular issues that it would not have been realistic for EPA to model at this point in time in their rulemaking process.
Thank you, Ms. Bloodworth. I could have said the same thing about you that I said about Mr. Campbell, in that you tell us exactly how you feel. So I'm looking forward to hearing your response.
Thank you, Chairman Phillips. Alabama accent. One of the things that I know you guys have talked a lot about, the analysis that EPA did. Certainly they don't have the expertise of the grid operators, and certainly FERC or NRECA. But I think it's important that people understand that the IPM model that EPA uses it projects resource adequacy into the future, either by using existing resources or the construction of new. In other words, the model adds hypothetical resources, whatever their model is going to say is most economical. It chooses that resource, no matter whether that resource gets built or not. It does not take into account. So basically, we think the model's flawed. It will never show a capacity shortfall. It will automatically add whatever is retired is replaced, and it does not look at those attributes. But in addition to that, the model's not looking at could the cost of transmission go up. It's assuming that whatever transmission is needed in order to move that generation to the load is going to be built. It does not look at supply chain challenges. You know, there's no scenario planning of, like a lot of the RTOs look at, you know, maybe higher renewable penetration, maybe higher coal retirements, higher demand, lower demand. It really doesn't look at any of those or the issues in delays. I mean, we've heard PJM has over 200 gigawatts of renewables. They're only able to get 5%. This analysis does not look at if any of those things don't properly all match up, and that's why we think that FERC, certainly with NERC, needs to ensure and work with the grid operators that that analysis is done so everyone in this room, we get that rule certainly right so we can continue to keep the lights on. Thank you.
I will stop right there and turn it over to Commissioner Danley for his questions.
Thank you. So a question that I asked MISO earlier this morning, and this is directed to PJM. So one of the assumptions that was built into the proposed rule is that it's expected that between the state regulators and the RTOs, EPA assumes that they're going to manage to have orderly retirements of the resources that are required. And I'm curious to hear what you think about the likelihood that you are able to manage that process in an orderly way, especially given the fact that you've been surprised with a number of retirements recently.
Thanks, yeah, and you know, I recognize the fact that I admit it's our job to manage that process in an orderly, but I am concerned about the volume and the interaction of transmission upgrades and keeping them around either under an RMR or, you know, we have to contemplate the DOE 202C as well because there are some circumstances where units refuse RMRs. We have that happen. And, you know, now we have to look at that, and that process is very unwieldy. So I do have concerns about doing it in an orderly way.
Just as a general matter, I'm pretty against RMRs, and it certainly doesn't seem like a very good way to structure any kind of a plan to run a utility system. You say, don't worry, we can use emergency authorities by DOE or out-of-market actions within a market. So, I mean, my hope is that it doesn't come to that. So another assumption is that there's going to be sufficient transmission built to accommodate the replacement gigawatts. And given people's experience, this is a more broad question, given people's experience with the development of transmission, what do you think the likelihood is that that assumption is valid? Yep.
If I may, so when we start a new transmission line today, it's a 10-year process, right? Because nobody wants transmission. So if it's brand new and doesn't have the right-of-ways, we're going to have to do condemnations, which is going to be tied up in court. And from cradle to grave, it's a 10-year process at least. So I think to say that's going to save the day is a fallacy right now. That's going to take more time too. I get that we're going to head there sometime, but not in the short term. And if I may stretch my answer one little bit more, in Storm Elliott, we had Storm Elliott. We were in the heart of that. And what we also found was that we need fuel security because we lost one transmission gas line to our plant and all plants that are on that line and shut us down. And we ran on diesel fuel, and then we lost two other lines to our other plants, so we really lost all of our natural gas. And we were running on diesel fuel. We burnt through 2.2 million gallons of diesel fuel, but we were on the cusp of going in the dark. Thankfully, it warmed up a couple days after Christmas. But that taught us a new lesson, too, is we have to have fuel security. One way or another, that's going to be required because in the heat of the moment, you can't just make make short-term decisions to fix the problem. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to address your good question about sort of can we build transmission? And we've heard like Sunzia today 3 times, I think, 15 years, 16 years, 17 years. Hopefully we're going to get better at that, and especially in the West, I think with BLM working on programmatic ES and EIS and better processes. But I also think, I wish Jennifer was still here from MISO because she could talk about the things that they're doing with LRTP Tranche 1. Really, a lot of those lines, 90% of those lines are in existing right-of-way, which I think will speed up the build of that. So I absolutely think it's a concern. We've got to build a lot of infrastructure, but we've done it before. We built 200 gigawatts of gas from 2000 to 2005. Texas has built, over 10 gigawatts of solar just in the last 12 months. So we can build in this country. I just think if this commission could help by issuing a muscular interregional planning rule, which I think would really help in terms of getting longer-term planning for transmission.
Go ahead.
I won't repeat the things that Rick said, but I would, if there were time, repeat the things that he said. I do want to point out that this morning's panel was really interesting because one of the takeaways that I had was that interregional transmission is essential in a world of extreme weather events. The picture in the FERC NERF staff report on December 24th, 2022 shows the enormous size of that weather event. It covered the entire Eastern Interconnect. Reliability is a reason to be building out the grid. Beneficiaries are broad regions. Thinking about beneficiaries is a new way to handle this issue. This is not about, and I'm not talking about the EPA regulations when I'm talking about this. I am talking about the world that we're operating in with enormous stress on the system. Oops.
Go ahead.
Just briefly, I do think we can build transmission. I think we need to be more proactive about it, and I think we have some steps I know at PJM we're doing with that, but we also need to recognize the fact that transmission, and this is true for storage, we still need the megawatts on top of that. We need to replace the megawatts as well.
Yeah, I
and so
hadn't
that's
even
just
gotten
important.
into that. Yeah. I mean, this is the problem. You can have a perfectly functioning transmission system, but if nobody, comes to play, you don't have anything to transmit. I think that those who have a sanguine outlook about this are probably wrong. My hope is that needed transmission can be built, and on the point of broad beneficiaries, there is an open and serious legal question as to how closely you have to tie and how arithmetically you have to demonstrate the actual benefit, the commensurate benefits with the cost. So we will see. I know that that is an effort that is afoot, and I don't know that it's going to work out for those who propose it. So here's a question again for PJM. Do you have any idea what the rate effects on the ratepayers are going to be if the EPA rule is implemented as proposed?
I don't, because again, we do resource adequacy through markets, and so one of the things that we will continue to do that, and we intend to do some analysis on that, but I don't have an idea what that is now. I have to expect that will be more expensive, but.
The question is not the direction of the vector, but the magnitude. Yeah. And then Michelle, so what if the rule is implemented? What do you think the likelihood is that even over that medium-term period, that coal plants are going to be able to implement these requirements and still remain solvent?
I think the likelihood is very, very little.
Microphone.
I think the likelihood is minuscule. And the reason I'm saying that is because, again, if you're an owner of a coal plant, you're looking at those 6 EPA regulations. You're also looking at, I need to make sure that I have a healthy coal supply chain as all this also is occurring. So basically, if EPA is saying, I'm going to finalize this rule next year in the summer of 2024, then states have 2 years to basically put together compliance plans. Then EPA has another year in order to approve those plans or reject those plans. And so if you want to keep your coal plant open past 2040, you have to, in 3 years, I have 4 members pursuing CCUS. It takes 8 to 10 years, and many of them are still developing those projects. They are telling me, the ones who are developing carbon capture on some of the youngest coal plants in the United States, that it is chilling and driving their investors away because, number one, they can achieve 90% capture. There's not one coal plant in the United States who can achieve 90% capture. The cost of CCUS, even with the IRA, that is not offsetting all of the carbon, the infrastructure, whether or not they have the geography or not. And so many of them are saying not only are they concerned with complying with the rule, but with driving away investment in order to make, whether that's 40% co-firing with natural gas. We already have a lack of pipeline infrastructure. Imagine if we're going to make all these coal plants require 40% gas. They're not going to do it. They're not going to spend that capital, and they're not going to survive if they're at a 20% capacity factor, because all of their fixed costs in order to move that coal to the plant, those costs remain the same, or they may be greater.
Okay, I have one last question. So this is for Mr. Campbell and Mr. Olsen. Assuming that the timelines are what they are and you have to comply with them, what do you plan to do? I'm not going to hold you to it. Just what in your mind are you thinking your options are?
So at our first thing is the IRA is a way to incentivize us to close coal plants, really. I mean, with all the rules in the IRA, that's what the incentive is. We made a conscious decision in our boardroom that we will not sell our reliability because we're so worried that reliability is going to become the issue in the United States. And so what we're doing right now is trying to find gas lines, and we're working diligently with the gas companies to bring gas to our 2 coal plants. It's a quantum effort. It's 40 miles of big high-pressure gas line that we got to run to both of our coal plants. And then we're trying to say, okay, well, if we do that, can we put more natural gas plants at that plant? Do we have transmission availability? And we do. So right now, that's what we're working, but it will probably be $800 million project to do that. But we really believe, with all our heart at East Kentucky Power Cooperative, that we're going too far too fast, and we're driving to crisis. And when we get to crisis, keeping our coal plants alive, even if we have to run them on natural gas for a little while, is imperative. Thank you.
For SRP, I mentioned a few of the items that we're doing with respect to my opening statement, and I would point to the fact that we've been planning on retiring our Coronado generating station by 2032. That date isn't incidental. We're actually retiring about 1,000 megawatts ahead of that as well, as we've already retired some. And when you look at that, those are partner coal stations for the most part. It's not just 2,600 megawatts of capacity coming off the grid for SRP. It's nearly 4,000 megawatts in the region that's coming off. So what are we doing? We're focusing on how we are facilitating transition. We've got board members and customers that want us to decarbonize. We see that as something that we're focused on. And that includes installing significant amounts of renewables. As I mentioned, the 7,000 megawatts of renewables, the 2,000 megawatts of storage. There's more detail there that's relevant. When we step back and we just look at it and put it in the magnitude of the system, that's going to be doubling the size of our system from a capacity perspective. It took us 120 years to build the system we have today, and in the next 10 years, the charter is to double it. It's not always the best job to be the planning guy, but that's what I'm going to do. And so we worked through how we're going to accomplish that, recognizing it's pretty significant. It's going to require not just investment in the simple battery storage and the renewables. We're installing pumped hydro storage, more than 1,000 megawatts of pumped hydro storage trying to get online by the same point in time. The biggest challenge that we will have as it comes to trying to implement and match the EPA's guidelines as we work through it today is going to be, what is the load that we have that comes in? Is that all high factor load? Is it all 24/7 load? And if we're working through it, what is the timeline of deploying the rest of that? There's no margin of error from a supply chain perspective, a labor perspective, and a construction and interconnection siting perspective. Those are all the challenges we have trying to get it accomplished.
Thank you. I appreciate. Sure. It would probably be quick since I have
Real
colleagues.
quick, I just wanted to say that we too have 2 issues. One, we're prematurely trying to close the plants. The second thing is we're seeing a phenomenal amount of growth, more growth than we've seen in the last 2 decades on our system, and it's heavy manufacturing that's coming back on onshoring in the United States, and we're going to have to build for that too.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Clements.
Thank you. You know, I hear a lot of concerns, and one observation about them is that they tend to assume nothing else changes in two ways. One, that the EPA isn't listening, and that these kind of concerns that are being expressed aren't being taken seriously, and that's very much not what I just heard from the principal deputy administrator, that talk to us about which specific pieces of the timeline, which specific units are going to struggle, right? So to me, there will be, we're not static on that front. And then the second way in which there's an assumption that nothing else is going to change is that FERC's not doing its job. And as I said this morning, FERC has a robust set of tools in its toolbox to modernize the grid, and regardless of this EPA rule, if we don't take these actions near term, the electricity system's going to be in trouble because it's old and it's outdated, and we're running like a VHS grid for a Hulu and Netflix society, and it's not going to work. So we have tools, and I want to ask about those as well. So I'll start with on the EPA front. Sue, you have so much experience to bring to the table, and I enjoyed starting to read your report yesterday. Can you talk a little bit more about how you see the flexibility aspects playing out, the flexibility for states and the flexibility on the timelines, other lessons learned that would come forward?
Yeah, I appreciate the states are eager to have more guidance, and I heard the principal deputy administrator saying that they were working on that and will continue to do so. Flexibility with regard to potentially looking at mass versus rate-based approaches, looking at trading approaches for emissions reductions. So states may have the opportunity, and the EPA has asked for comments on those things. The way in which EPA has looked at the operating horizons or these lead times prior to announced closures or announced retirements, along with the expectations of different categories of gas plants associated with how often they're operating, and coal plants in the same way. Already we are seeing the coal fleet moving into those patterns of operations, which are very low capacity factors for a very large portion of the fleet that is being driven not by these EPA regulations, but by market realities with natural gas prices. And so there are a number of flexibilities. The report that I just finished, I know you'll just love looking at all of those tools that I identified that have been available in the past and are looking to be available in the future.
Yeah, and one thing it did say as a follow-up, can you help us put it in context, the impact of this rule? I think Commissioner Christie asked this question earlier, relevant to the changes you see coming. How much of an impact will this set of affected supply resources and changes to them and potential retirements of some of them have on system reliability?
Yeah, I heard the EPA team talking about the baseline, and the baseline is a world in which there is significant adoption of renewable energy and storage, and that's being very much driven by market economics and public policy, including by the states and the federal government. But moreover, the work that you have entertained here at FERC with NERC to look at and ask the industries to think about the gas-electric coordination problems. In my opinion, the gas-electric coordination problems are way bigger than the incremental effect of this rule. So, and that is based on many, many hours herding cats, wonderful cats at the NASB process. That is real today. It must be addressed today. I am so appreciative of the attention and spotlight that NERC and FERC have been placing on that. More work needs to be done on that. And I wish there were that being discussed this afternoon in terms of the importance of the changes underway.
Thank you. Well, we're appreciative of you and Pat Wood and Bob G's work on that front. On the tools front, on what is FERC responsible for, we have jurisdiction over retirement planning. So maybe it needs to speed up. maybe it needs to be noticed earlier, maybe there needs to be an anticipatory planning process related to potential retirements. There are lots of things that are within the commission's jurisdiction. You know, we are responsible for ensuring that market changes are just and reasonable and non-discriminatory. We have responsibility over, once you get to transmission development, we have responsibility more in the near term over getting more efficiency out of our existing system. So there's a tremendous set of tools that is incumbent upon this commission to ensure we are using. And then there is also, you know, robust transmission planning, which seems to be critical. And the timelines, not every transmission line takes 18 years, to Rick's point. But I have a question for you, Rick. Can you talk more about the modeling that's getting used on this rule, and then also the modeling that falls within the grid planners and FERC's jurisdiction, and those other tools, whether they be market or system planning, that help to move the ball forward and facilitate the reliability as this rule and others come into play?
Yeah, sure. I guess I would say that I spend a lot of time at the states helping them with IRP modeling, and that's exactly, you know, Michelle sort of talked about how there's these new resources show up, and that's exactly the purpose of IRP planning, right, is to sort of identify new resources, identify retirements. I think one of the things that the commission could do on this topic would be, you know, better generator replacement processes. I think there's a lot of opportunity to use the really valuable interconnection at some of these. If these older plants are going to retire, there's a very valuable interconnection, and some organized markets have really good generator replacement policies. Some don't have such a good policy. So I think that's part of the planning that really needs to help. And I think we're also sort of pushing that planning happens in the IRP process. Like if states are looking forward far ahead and understand that retirements are coming, that they can then plan for replacement resources. And one other sort of topic on this, you know, it might be interesting, you know, Europe does this really interesting resource adequacy assessment. There's a national resource adequacy assessment. You know, right now NRECA does a fantastic job of kind of rolling up resource adequacy assessments from each of the EROs, right? But there isn't really a national look. And that could be something that NRECA or the commission looked at more carefully, what's happening with a more comprehensive look at resource adequacy.
Thanks. Do I have time to let them answer this question? Emily, and then.
If we ended soon, we'd be pretty close to time. So I think maybe one more question.
Okay, no more questions, just letting Emily.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I will say that 2/3 of this rule actually address existing units, and so the primary regulator is actually going to be the states, and they actually have to set these standards on a unit-by-unit basis. EPA's proposal are actually just presumptively approvable standards, and so to the extent that states need help assessing the reliability impacts of any of the proposed retirements, I think FERC and NRECA and others with expertise should be available to help them make those determinations and then set standards and timelines that make sense.
Thanks.
Mr. Christie.
I want to ask Mr. Campbell and Mr. Olsen, because you both represent different forms of public power, member-owned co-ops. I think you're a state subdivision in Arizona, but you're public power in one form or another. And I asked Mr. Goffman if they'd analyzed how many plants would be able to finance compliance under two models. One, markets, and the second was rate-based. But you all don't, you have different funding models because you're.
We're rate base.
Well, but your members, you're not stockholder owned, your members. So just both of you respond to how I think you're a generation owning co-op, and obviously I know SRP owns generation. How would you finance compliance, and how would you run it through to your customers? Because we know that's who always ends up paying.
So if I can go first, we borrow from the government rural utility services, and we've already talked to them about financing, and they said that they would step to the plate and finance that. Obviously, we'll have to build our equity up. Our equity, we keep at about 20% because we don't want to hold the stockholders, which are the people at the end of the line's money. But we're going to have to build that up because we're going to have a huge build, you know, potentially $1.5 to $2 billion. From an end consumer perspective, there's going to be a lot of end consumers that can't afford it, and we're going to have to do something to help those people afford this.
When it comes to SRP, you know, I spoke of fairly aggressive expansion plans with respect to our system. And we recognize that the way that we would plan on financing that is through a combination of SRP-owned assets as well as looking for partnership of developers and others who are willing to put their own capital into the space. And that really functions through two different recovery mechanisms from a pricing perspective. The way that we're thinking about this is the assets that actually contribute specifically to reliability that will represent those no-regret strategies long-term. Those are the assets that we would likely be looking at moving into rate base and financing. And we have a variety of financing mechanisms to work through. We've not analyzed the specific risk of financing with respect to the compliance of this, but we've been successful in going forward in financing for similar type of assets, including new generation and transmission.
Okay. I don't have any more questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Actually, did you have anything else? Anybody?
Thanks, Chairman. I think that takes us to our time limit here. And we'll take another 5-minute break to do a panel change and reconvene at 3:36.
Thank you.